Out in the countryside, far from city lights, darkness feels different. Not empty, just deeper. Tonight, the midnight drive leaves the highway behind, and we are heading into rural Iowa, near a place called Iron Hill. There are no landmarks here, no signs pointing the way, just open land and long stretches of road. Fields that fade into darkness, a horizon that disappears once the sun goes down. But some nights, people say that you can see something out here. Lights floating in the distance, moving slowly across the fields, drifting where nothing should be moving at all, and disappearing just as quietly as they appeared. No sound, no source, just a glow in the darkness, waiting to be noticed. In Floyd County, Iowa, just outside of Charles City, there's a stretch of countryside that looks completely ordinary. Open fields, gravel roads, long horizons that stretch out beneath the sky. During the day, there's nothing unusual about the area. Farm equipment moves steadily across the land. Wind passes through the tall grass. Clouds drift slowly overhead. It's quiet. It's predictable. The kind of place where everything feels familiar. But at night, the landscape changes. Without streetlights, the darkness settles in quickly. The sky deepens. The ground fades. The horizon disappears entirely. And with it, your sense of distance. What once felt open and expansive becomes very hard to read, closer, more enclosed. Even though nothing is physically changed out here, light behaves differently. Even the smallest glow becomes noticeable. A distant farmhouse window, a far-off vehicle, a flicker of movement on the horizon. Which is why over time people began to notice something unusual near Iron Hill. Lights, appearing where there shouldn't be any. At first, the sightings were simple, a small point of light in the distance. Easy to dismiss, easy to explain. Maybe it's a vehicle, maybe it's a reflection. But then came the details. The lights were not staying in one place. They moved, slowly drifting across the fields. Sometimes hovering just above the ground. Other times rising slightly before setting again. Witnesses describe them in different ways. Some say they look like lanterns. They have a soft glow about them. They're warm, flickering. Others describe something more defined. Small orbs of light. White, orange, occasionally bluish. Sometimes steady, sometimes pulsing faintly. And what makes them unusual isn't just their appearance, it's their behavior, because they don't follow a clear path. They don't move like vehicles. They don't stay fixed like distant lights. Instead, they drift. They pause. They change direction. As if they're responding to something that we can't see. In some reports, the lights appear briefly, and then they vanish, only to reappear somewhere else just moments later, further away, sometimes closer, with no visible transition between the two. At first, many people assumed they were seeing headlights, cars traveling on distant roads, light bending across the landscape in ways that made it appear displaced. But people familiar with the area began to point something out. There are no roads in those directions. No houses, no structures, nothing that should be producing light at all. And once that detail became part of the story, the sightings began to feel different, more mysterious, less explainable. Over time, the phenomenon became part of the local folklore. People began referring to them as the Iron Hill Ghost Lights. Stories spread quietly, shared between neighbors, mentioned in passing. Something you might hear about if you spent enough time in the area. And just like most local legends, it didn't take long before curiosity followed. People began driving out to see the lights for themselves, late at night, parking on empty roads, turning off their headlights, letting their eyes adjust to the darkness, waiting, watching. At first, nothing happens. It's just the open fields, the wind, the distant sound of insects. The kind of quiet that feels almost complete. But after a while, your perception begins to change. Small details become more noticeable. A shift in brightness. A flicker at the edge of your vision. And then, sometimes, you see it. A light. Far out in the distance. Faint at first. Almost easy to miss, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it. It moves. Slowly. Not in a straight line, not in a predictable way, just drifting. As if it has no clear destination. And in that moment, something changes. Because even if you know there could be an explanation, even if you understand how light can behave in open landscapes, seeing it in person just feels different. The distance, the silence, the lack of any visible source, it creates a moment of uncertainty. A brief pause where your mind tries to make sense of what you're seeing, and it doesn't quite succeed. Some people try to approach the lights, driving toward where they appeared, but as they get closer, the lights fade or disappear entirely, leaving nothing behind. No trace. No explanation. Others stay where they are, watching, waiting to see if the light will return. Sometimes it does, other times it doesn't. But either way, the experience stays with them because once you've seen something like that, the landscape doesn't quite feel the same. The next time that you drive on those roads at night, you notice more. You watch the horizon more closely. You question what it is that you're seeing. And that's how places like Iron Hill become part of folklore. Not through proof, not through documentation, but through repetition. Through shared experience. Through people going out into the dark and seeing something that they can't fully explain. And as long as those lights continue to appear, even occasionally, the story continues, waiting for the next person to notice. What do you make of the Iron Hill lights? Let us know in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something similar to this? There are a lot of different stories in a lot of different regions that have similar lore. We'd love to hear about it. Feel free to reach out to us on our hotline, the Midnight Drive, 402-610-2836. So what are they? Tonight, we're talking about the Iron Hill Lights just outside of Charles City, Iowa. Now, you need to understand that ghost lights are not unique to Iowa. Similar phenomena have been reported all over the world. In Texas, they're known as the Marfa Lights. In North Carolina, the Brown Mountain Lights. In Australia, the Min Lights. Different locations, different names, but remarkably similar descriptions. Floating lights, unpredictable movement, appearing in remote areas, and disappearing without explanation. For decades, scientists have tried to understand these phenomena, to find patterns, to identify causes, to separate observation from interpretation. Several explanations have been proposed. One of the most common involves natural gases. In certain environments, gases like methane can accumulate beneath the surface. When released, these gases can sometimes ignite or interact with the air in unusual ways, creating faint, flickering lights, small flames that appear briefly and then fade. In swampy areas, this phenomenon is sometimes called will-o'-the-wisp, a natural process that in the right conditions can look surprisingly mysterious. But the terrain near Iron Hill doesn't always match those conditions, which raises questions about whether that explanation fully applies. Another possibility involves atmospheric conditions. Temperature differences in the air can bend light over long distances, a phenomenon known as refraction. Under the right circumstances, light from distant sources can appear displaced, lifted above the horizon, or shifted sideways. This could make headlights or distant buildings appear in places where they shouldn't be visible, creating the illusion of floating lights. And in wide open landscapes like rural Iowa, those effects can be amplified. Distances are harder to judge. Light travels farther. And the lack of visual reference points makes everything feel more ambiguous. A small, distant light can appear closer than it actually is, or higher, or moving differently than it really is. There are also theories involving electrical activity. In rare cases, natural plasma formations may occur, small, glowing spheres of energy, sometimes referred to as ball lightning. These phenomena are not fully understood and are incredibly difficult to study, and they're rarely observed under controlled conditions. But they've been reported often enough to remain part of the conversation. Still, none of these explanations account for every detail, because many witnesses describe something that feels more complex, more deliberate. Lights that don't just drift, but they respond. Lights that seem to move toward observers or farther away from them. Lights that change direction abruptly without any visible cause, and then vanish. Not gradually, not fading into the distance, but disappearing completely. Of course, human perception plays a significant role. In darkness, the brain works harder. It tries to interpret limited information, to create meaning from incomplete visuals. Small movements can appear larger. Distant objects can feel closer. And motion can seem more intentional than it really is. The brain is constantly trying to answer a question. What am I looking at? And when it doesn't have enough information, it fills in the gaps, turning uncertainty into something recognizable, sometimes into something meaningful. And when you're already expecting something unusual, that effect becomes even stronger. If you've been listening to the Midnight Drive for any amount of time now, you've started to notice this theme, that when you're already expecting something unusual, the effect will become stronger. But even with all of that considered, the mystery remains, because not every sighting fits neatly into those explanations. And for the people who have seen the lights firsthand, the question isn't just what they are, it's how they behave and what they seem to do and why they appear at all. There's also something else that often gets overlooked: the environment. Standing in an open field at night is a very different experience than standing in a city. There are no buildings to reflect light, no constant noise, no visual anchors, just distance, darkness, and sky. And in that kind of space, even a small light feels significant. It draws your attention immediately. It holds your attention. And you find yourself focusing on it longer than you normally would, watching to see if it moves, if it changes, if it disappears. And the longer you look at it, the more your perception begins to shift. What started as a small distant light becomes something that you're tracking, following, trying to understand. And then something subtle happens. You start anticipating it, where it might go next, whether it will move closer, whether it will vanish, anything. Some people bring friends to the field to try to see these lights. Others go alone. Some treat it like a challenge, and others approach it quietly and curiously. But almost everyone goes out there to do the same thing. They stare at the horizon, looking for a break in the darkness, a flicker, a glow. And most nights, nothing happens. The field remains dark. The sky stretches overhead, silent and still, exactly as you would expect. But every so often, someone sees a light, small, distant, drifting across the horizon. And in that moment, the explanation doesn't matter as much because the experience itself is enough. That brief uncertainty, the quiet question, that sense that something might be happening just beyond our understanding. And even after it appears, the feeling doesn't go away immediately. You keep looking, scanning the horizon, waiting for it to return. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But either way, something has changed. Because once you've seen something like that, the landscape doesn't feel quite as empty anymore. Tonight, the midnight drive moved through open country, past the edges of towns, into places where the horizon feels literally endless, and where sometimes something appears in the distance. Not close enough to reach, not clear enough to understand, but just visible enough to make you stop, to make you watch, to make you wonder. Not every story has a clear beginning, and not every story can be traced back to a single moment in time. Some just appear, passed from one person to another, growing a little each time that they are told, until eventually the story has become part of the place itself. And whether it started as something real or something imagined, almost stops mattering.